But there are other things, taken from the part of creatures, which seem to show the same thing. For those things which have no power not to be, it is impossible for them not to be. But there are certain things in creatures in which there is no power not to exist. For there can be no power not to be except in those things which have matter subject to contrariety. For the power to be and not to be is the power to privation and form, the subject of which is matter. But privation is always joined to the opposite form, since it is impossible for matter to exist without all form. But there are certain creatures in which there is no matter subject to contrariety, either because they have no matter at all, such as intellectual substances, as will be shown below, or they do not have the opposite, like the heavenly bodies, which shows their movement, which has no opposite. Therefore it is impossible for certain creatures not to exist. Therefore they must always be. Again, each thing endures in being only as much as its own power of being, except by accident, as in those things which are violently corrupted. But there are certain creatures in which the power of being exists, not for a fixed time, but to be always, such as celestial bodies and intellectual substances, for they are incorruptible, since they have no opposite. It is left therefore that it belongs to them always to be. But what begins to be is not always, therefore it is not proper for them to begin to exist. Still, whenever something begins to move anew, it is necessary that the mover, or the motion, or both behave differently now when there is motion, than before when there was no motion. But a new relationship does not begin without a change in both, or at least one of the other ends. But what is different now and before is moved. Therefore, before a movement that begins anew, another movement in the mobile or in the mover must precede. It is necessary, therefore, that every movement either be eternal or have another movement before it. So there was always movement, therefore, and mobiles. And so creatures have always been, for God is absolutely immovable, as was shown in the first chapter. In addition, every agent, which begets something similar to itself, intends to maintain a permanent existence in the species, which cannot be permanently maintained in the individual. Now it is impossible that the appetite of nature should be vain. It is therefore necessary that the species of general things be perpetual. Still, if time is eternal, motion must be eternal, since there is a number of motions, and consequently that the movables are perpetual, since motion is a movable act. But time must be eternal. For time cannot be understood unless it is now, just as a line cannot be understood without a point. But now is always the end of the past and the beginning of the future. For this is the definition of the now, and so every given thing now has before it a time before and after, and so there can be no first or last. It is therefore left that the movables, which are created substances, are from eternity. Again, it must either be affirmed or denied. If therefore his position follows from the negation of something, it must always be so. But the time is like this. For if time has not always existed, it is necessary to accept its non-existence before its existence. And in the same way, if there is not always a future, it must be that his non-being must be posterior to his being. But the former and the latter cannot be according to duration unless there is time. For the number of the former and the latter is time. And so it must be that there was time before it began, and that it will be after it ends. Therefore time must be eternal. But time is an accident. It cannot exist without a subject. But his subject is not God, who is above time, since he is completely immovable, as was proved in the first place. It therefore remains that some created substance is eternal. Further, many propositions are in such a way that he who denies them must posit them, just as he who denies that there is a truth posits that there is a truth. for he posits that the truth which he asserts is negative, and it is similar to him who denies this principle, that there is no contradiction at the same time. For he who denies this says that the negation he posits is true, and the opposite affirmation is false, and thus both cannot be verified from the same thing. If, therefore, that to whose removal its position follows must always be, as has been proved, it follows that the aforesaid propositions, and all that follow from them, are eternal. But these propositions are not God. Therefore something besides God must be eternal. Therefore these and similar reasons can be taken from the side of creatures because they have always been creatures.